Well, I think we'll get started now. I'd first like to welcome you to the latest webinar presented by the CMT Association. My name is Rick Albert, and I co-moderate one of the support groups out here in California. Today's webinar is entitled Genetics and CMT Q&A. We're very fortunate to have CMTA Advisory Board members Shawna Feely and Carly Siskin here to share their knowledge with us. Before I introduce them, I'd like to explain how the webinar works. Each of the attendees should see a large window on their screen displaying the first page of a PowerPoint slide presentation. Shawna will advance the slides in that window as she and Carly speak. You should also see a webinar dashboard window, which contains a question area where you can type in questions during the webinar. Following their presentation, Shawna and Carly will address those questions if they haven't been covered already. You can also use the question area to address any concerns about the webinar, including volume levels, window display problems, or whatever, directly to me while they're speaking. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be archived at the CMTA website at cmtausa.org under the Resources tab on that website's front page. It'll take about a week before the recording is uploaded to the site, but once it's there, you'll be able to see these slides, read a transcript of all that is said during the webinar. Shawna Feely, MS-CJC, is a board-certified genetic counselor with a specialty in neurogenetics and CMT. She was previously an assistant professor at Wayne State University, where she helped to provide genetic counseling services and coordinate the WSU CMT Clinic with Dr. Michael Shy. She's now moved to the University of Iowa, where she's helping to establish a center of excellence with Dr. Shy. She has worked closely with CMTA in the past, speaking at patient and family conferences, at the CMT SAG facilitator conference, and at local support groups. She's looking forward to continuing this work at the Iowa Center of Excellence and as a new member of the CMTA Advisory Board. Carly Siskin, MS-CGC, is a board-certified genetic counselor with a specialty in CMT. She is currently working at Stanford University and Hospital and at the Lucile Packard Children's Hospital. She's previously worked for 4 years as a genetic counselor, assistant professor, and clinic coordinator at Wayne State University in the CMT Clinic. She is the project manager of the Inherited Neuropathies Consortium, part of the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network. Her involvement with the CMTA has included speaking at patient and family conferences, the CMT SAG Facilitator Conference, writing articles for the CMTA Report, and being a resource for general genetic questions. She's very happy to be able to lend her expertise as a member of the CMTA Advisory Board as well. With that, I'd like to welcome Shawna and Carly.
Thank you, Rick. Carly and I are excited to be here and talking about genetics and CMT, which we love to talk about. It's a complicated topic, I know, and we have been running a forum on the CMTA website for genetics questions. So we basically just designed this talk around some of the questions that have come in. So the talk itself is designed as a Q&A for some of the common questions that seem to come up regarding this topic. So I'll just go ahead and get started. Maybe. One of the main topics or questions that come up is CMT a type of muscular dystrophy? And I think the link commonly comes from the fact that CMT is one of the covered conditions under the Muscular Dystrophy Association. But CMT is not a type of muscular dystrophy. When we think of a muscular dystrophy, it's a problem that originates in the muscle. And CMT is a problem that causes a problem with the nerve going to that muscle. So even though the result is the same, a dysfunction of muscle, it's similar to the analogy of a wire going to a light bulb. So the light bulb being the muscle and the wire being the nerve. And so either way, if the muscle or nerve or the wire or the light bulb is not working, the muscle can't do its job or the light bulb can't light up. But the problem in CMT is actually stemming from the nerve. So muscular dystrophy is considered a myopathy because it's a result of a disease of the muscle itself. And CMT is considered a neuropathy because it is a problem that originates in the nerve. Carly, did you want to? I'm not hearing Carly, so I can keep going. So can you have a diagnosis of CMT without genetic testing is another question that commonly comes in. So CMT is a genetic condition that affects the long nerves that go out to the hands and the feet. And that's usually diagnosed by doing an evaluation called a neurological exam and a history to see if there's been progressive symptoms, and then things like an EMG or nerve conduction study to see if there's a problem that's going on in the nerve itself. There are many types of CMT, and not all of them can be diagnosed through genetic testing. So you can have CMT and a diagnosis of CMT without knowing the genetic cause. They are often classified into different groups, subgroups. So CMT Type 1, CMT Type 2, and CMT Type 4 are common subgroups. These classifications come from how it's being passed on in the family and also how it's affecting the nerve, the outside part or the inside part of the nerve. So this is a picture of a cross-section of a nerve, and you can see the outside part we call the myelin, and the inside part, that center area, is called the axon. And CMT Type 1 refers to problems that are being caused in the myelin, the outside part. And CMT Type 2 refers to problems that are occurring in the center part, the axon. The other way, again, that these are divided is by how they're being passed on in the family. And so dominant forms are both in Type 1 and Type 2, but recessive forms are in Type 4, and I'll get into what that means. Do we have you back with us, Carly?
Can you hear me?
I can now, yes.
Oh, Rick asked me to reboot my computer, so I'm not able to see the actual slide.
Okay.
Would you mind continuing until
Sure.
I get it back up?
Okay.
Thank you.
So this umbrella is supposed to sort of help break down how these different types of CMT are grouped. Again, CMT Type 1 and Type 2 are both what we call autosomal dominant. That's simply a way that CMT is passed on in a family. And then there are X-linked types of CMT that we call CMT Type X, and there's recessive forms of CMT. Again, all of these are patterns of inheritance, how something is being passed on in a family. So we use the way that it's being passed on in a family, so that pattern, and how the nerve is being affected, whether it's affecting the myelin, the outside, or the center part, to know what type, what subgroup a person falls into. So you can have a diagnosis of CMT 1, 2, or 4, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you've had genetic testing, but that is a clinical diagnosis of CMT. It's only after that, when you have a letter like CMT Type 1A, that you have the specific genetic cause that's known. Not everyone has a genetically defined type of CMT. Not everyone decides to get genetic testing. That's personal decision, and genetic counselors like myself and Carly help people weigh the pros and cons of that. And genetic testing itself cannot always determine the cause for everyone's types of CMT yet. We just haven't identified all the genetic causes of CMT. So just because you have not identified the genetic cause of your CMT does not mean that you don't have CMT. I added a couple of slides here about the pros and cons of testing, which I hit on just earlier. But basically, there are a number of reasons why people would get testing, to determine if other people are at risk, for family planning purposes, and for access to future clinical trials. Also, people, can be reassured when they finally have a definitive diagnosis and they know what's causing symptoms. But in terms of genetic testing, it's not for everyone. Some people may have inconclusive test results, which are not clearly giving you the answer. There can be an emotional impact of positive or negative testing in an individual, or frustration over not having a known cause. And there may, like I said, may not be genetic testing available for everyone. Of course, there is the component of cost, which we'll go into further in a couple of slides. And sometimes people have concerns about genetic discrimination. Are you back with us, Carly?
I am. I would actually like to add one thing to the pros column. One of the questions that was sent to us when we were gearing up for this webinar was saying that their neurologist doesn't see a good reason to do the genetic testing, given that there isn't any known treatment at the moment. This particular person also had some additional concerns, but was getting some medication that isn't necessarily appropriate for people who have CMT, so she was getting IVIG. So getting a genetic diagnosis would let the person and the neurologist know whether or not that additional type of therapy would actually be appropriate or potentially useful if it came back with a positive result.
And I think that's an important point, because a lot of times providers are asked to provide documentation about why this changes medical management in order to have coverage through insurance. So if the provider, provider is getting pressure from the insurance company to provide medical documentation that it changes medical management, and if they can't, then the test may not be covered. So that's why it's important to try to work with your provider and figure out how this does change your medical management, so you can get the cost of testing covered. And sometimes, working with a genetic counselor can help with that too, because we can help with the documentation that's required for that.
So it is possible to have CMT without a family history. So it is possible to be the first person in the family that's affected with CMT. And this can happen for a couple of reasons. So starting with some definitions, de novo mutation means a new mutation, and it's a change in the DNA that occurs in a person but isn't present in either parent. So it isn't something, even though it's genetic, that was inherited. A mutation is just any change in the DNA that can cause a change in the protein. That usually means that the protein is made correctly. And the two ways that we end up getting a new, the first person in the family affected is either by being the first person with a new de novo mutation in dominant inherited pattern, meaning that there's a brand new mutation in one of the genes, and in this particular gene, it only takes one mutation and one copy of the gene in order to be affected. So keeping in mind that you get two copies of every gene, one from your mom and one from your dad, if there's a mutation in just one of them, then you can have the condition in dominant inheritance. That's as opposed to recessive inheritance, where you need to actually have a mutation in both copies of the gene in order to be affected. So a person who has a mutation in only one copy of the gene doesn't have the condition at all. They are a carrier. They do not tend to have any signs, symptoms, any problems related to CMT. It's only when they have when their partner is also a carrier for mutation in the same gene, and they both pass on that mutation, that they might have a child that is affected with the condition.
So a big question that comes up often, very often, is how do I get genetic testing done in an affordable way? There are many, many, many mutations or genes that can cause various forms of CMT, and it's expensive to do testing for all of them. It's also hard to know what to test, where to get testing, like, for example, which labs to do testing at. And what the cost, what the out-of-pocket expenses will be. So when we're talking about these subgroups of CMT, these CMT1, Type 2, and Type 4, they're helpful for clinicians and for patients to sort of help classify where their symptoms are, but it's also a good way to try to narrow down what you would test for. Because if someone has a clinically defined CMT Type 1, you wouldn't go after CMT Type 2's genetic causes for CMT Type 2. You would focus your testing on types that cause CMT Type 1. So in the same way that we start narrowing the clinical picture that someone presents with by using nerve conductions and how it's being passed on in the family, we can also use these clues to narrow down what we would test for. And that really helps to eliminate costs, because then you don't have to go after large panels of genes. There are now many labs that are doing testing, and there is a new type of test that they're doing called next generation sequencing. This is a way of targeting large amounts of genes and testing them all at the same time, instead of doing traditional what we call Sanger sequencing, where you go into one gene at a time and look at for spelling changes or spelling mistakes in a single gene at a time. There are still discrepancies from one lab to another in terms of how many genes they test for, overall cost, how long it takes to get results back. And there are still traditional genetic testing available that might be the cheaper option. If you can narrow down to one most likely genetic cause, then you still want to just try to test for that one gene. And that's where working with a knowledgeable physician and genetic counselor who can help guide testing can get test costs down to, one gene, which may be $1,000 or as little as $300, depending on the gene. And it's much more reasonable to have insurance cover that. So there's a combination of a lot of factors that help us narrow down genetic testing through nerve conductions, family history, clinical exam, and working with people who can help narrow that picture so that you're not having to order large panels of genes that add extra money to each time you add, testing.
Can I ask a question, Shawna?
Yes.
The previous slide where you listed 3 or 4 or 5 different providers that offer these tests, the cost or the price for the testing varies pretty dramatically, it seems, at least with comparison between Athena and the others. Is there any information on the reliability or the accuracy of the results of these tests? Can we pretty much rely on any one of these tests for reliable results?
Well, that again also it helps to work with the clinic team, because then they can make sure that what they find genetically matches what your symptoms are, so that it makes sense. Because doing this type of sequencing where they're testing for many, many genes, they may find many variants that we don't know if they're disease causing or not, and we'll talk about what a variant is later. Also, a lot of the labs.
Testing.
What's that?
All of these labs do the same type of testing, and I've done a couple of these tests between the same person between a couple of labs, and I got the same results. And I feel very comfortable that all of these places are going to give you the same answers. It does become a question in some cases how to interpret those answers. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, it's a question about what testing are they actually doing. So, for example, like the medical neurogenetics doesn't do PMP22 duplication or deletion testing, but they do PMP22 sequencing. So if you didn't read into the fine print of the testing and you sent your DNA there, you probably wouldn't realize if it came back all negative that there's still a chance of a PMP22 duplication. So it requires doing a bunch of research on each of the labs, but any one of them that has the results, we feel very comfortable that that actual change in the gene is going to be true.
Great. Thank you very much.
So there is DNA testing for CMT Type 2. It's much easier in 2014 to find the answer, the genetic answer for the Type 1s than it is for the Type 2s. And so it's hard to say exactly if you're going to send away even for one of these huge panels, if it's going to come back with a positive answer. It's probably still not a huge percentage that is going to come back positive. We do have a few more tools in our pocket now than we did even 2 years ago, but there's still a lot that we don't know. So we're still trying to find causes of axonal neuropathy, and so it's still important to work with a physician, genetic counselor to help guide testing, but also being able to potentially participate in research. If you have testing and it's negative, there may be additional ways for us to help figure out the genetic cause in the family and maybe find new genes that can help other people with CMT that are also trying to find the cause in their families. And like it says here, the trade-off is time when we're talking about research testing. It usually is done on, it's free when it's being done, but it's being done at the time it takes a lab to decide that it has the resources to do it. So it isn't a like those turnaround times you saw on those other labs, up to 14 weeks, which may seem like a long time. This could be years waiting to get a result.
Often we have questions about whether genetic testing has changed, and as you can see, there are a lot of changes going on. So people may have had testing in 2001 or 2004, and yes, there are many changes that have occurred since those the times when testing was done before. So there's many new genetic causes of CMT that have been identified. So that means that if you had testing in 2004 and your physician ordered like a panel, so you thought you had all the testing done, you had all the testing that was available in 2004, but not all the tests that are available right now in 2014, and this will continue to grow. There's also, as we have shown, new ways of performing genetic testing to include more genes, and that gives you more information. And some of that information is hard to weed through to know what's actually causing disease and what's not. The other good thing is that there's now new laboratories doing testing, and the hope is that that will drive costs down and help testing be available for more people. The new testing methods, as I described a bit earlier, are screening more than one gene at a time. So if we think of a single gene that's on one chromosome, traditional methods of testing were to look at the sequence of letters that represent the genetic code and see if there's any changes, like spelling mistakes in those sequence of letters, that would change the amino acids that are created and ultimately change the function of the protein. So that's what we would do, is we would go into one single gene, look at that code, and see if there's a change or a spelling mistake that's causing a change in that gene to cause disease. But exome sequencing is a new way of testing large amounts of data, basically screening our entire active genome, so screening all genes that actively produce a protein. This is a lot and a lot of data to screen through. This is a picture of a research lab that actually printed out all of the genes sequence on all of the chromosomes. So you can see all the books are grouped by color. So for example, the biggest chromosome, chromosome 1, all the way over in the yellow there, all of those books relate to the genetic code of everything on chromosome 1, versus the 1 all the way over the dark green book on the right is the smallest one, chromosome Y, so it has the fewest amount of genes on it. So you can see these are all the volumes of data that we're basically screening through to try to identify mutations that could be new causes of CMT. Exome sequencing allows you to do that, to sequence all of these active genes. But the problem is it will find many mutations that we all have, and they may not be disease-causing. So we have to weed through all of that like a needle in a haystack to find the mutations that actually cause symptoms. And this is available through our consortium on a research basis as well, so it's not run through insurance. But it's helpful to have at least 3 samples from family members so we can narrow down what is disease-causing to identify the mutation that's causing disease and eliminate just benign changes that don't cause disease that are being passed on in the family. So these projects are available only because of the advancements in genetic testing. And this is just an example of a single person's exome results and how much data you obtain. These are all different mutations, and if you scroll down, the list would go on of just how many mutations a single person has and how much data you would have to weed through to identify that genetic cause.
And when we go through these, we tend to find these variants of uncertain significance. So this is true not only with exome sequencing, where there's probably going to be 1,000 different changes, at least, that are picked up, but even when you get a small panel from a traditional testing company, there's often changes that are found in it that they don't know the significance. My guess is there's some people on this call right now that have had some kind of report that looks like this, where they get a change in a gene that is called a variant of uncertain significance, and they don't have any additional information as to whether or not this is actually disease-causing. And for some people, it may be that you've had a physician or someone say to you, yes or no, this is absolutely is or is not a disease-causing mutation. And we've had experience on both ends where that was true and that was actually not the case. I think the things that we tend to find the most often is that somebody will have a variant in a gene that actually causes a recessive form of CMT, so that you need to have 2 mutations within the gene in order to be affected. The person only has 1 mutation, and they've had someone tell them that that 1 mutation is enough to be causative and give them a diagnosis, whereas that is not really a true answer. When we look at the variants of uncertain significance, we have to go through it and think about it piece by piece. So the first thing that Shawna and I look at when we're looking at these is above the arrow there that says amino acid change. So it's glycine to arginine. And that's the #1 thing when we're talking about a variant of uncertain significance is there a change in the amino acid? We always talk about DNA when we're talking about genes and how there can be a change in the DNA, and that's what causes somebody's CMT. But it isn't really the change in the DNA specifically that's the issue. It's what it does to the protein that's being made. Proteins are made up of amino acids. They all get pulled together like beads on a string. And if the amino acid is not the one that it's supposed to be, it can change the way that the protein gets put together. And that can cause the protein to not work properly or to be folded improperly or something happening to the protein that causes the nerves to not work properly. So that's #1, is looking at the amino acid. There's also, though, there can be a change in the amino acid that really isn't a big deal. So there's 20 amino acids total, and they're grouped in different categories. So they have different charges, they have different polarities, and if you end up having a change in a amino acid that goes from one that's positively charged to another one that's positively charged, it's not going to be necessarily a huge difference as it would be if it's from a positively charged amino acid to a negatively charged amino acid. So it's not always easy to tell that kind of information, but that's another piece that we tend to look at. This is a kind of an older report that you're seeing on your screen. The newer reports do tend to give a little bit more information about the particular variant and what's happening. So usually it gets, information gets put in, such as if it's been seen in the literature, if it's been seen within the lab before, how many times it's been seen, how many times it's been seen in people who do not have any symptoms. It usually talks about the amino acid, and if the amino acid is the same in many different species, like if it's always a glycine, or if every once in a while maybe it shows up as an arginine. And it usually also gives some information as to some software predictions for protein. And these things are kind of going out of style, but they tend to just say this is predicted damaging or this is predicted benign, something like that. And they might not agree with each other, which is why it's kind of going out of style. So laboratories usually give that kind of information. If you have one of these reports from Athena specifically, that's like this one that doesn't have any information about the variant, you can ask Athena to run a variant reclassification on it, and they'll look to see if there's any updates and give you a score as to if they think it's more likely pathogenic or more likely benign, or if it's been reclassified as one or the other. So it's always appropriate to keep asking questions. For this particular patient, we ended up doing a literature search and looking up this variant, and found that it was reported in a paper to be present in 3% of controls, meaning that 3% of people who do not have CMT had this specific change within their DNA. So based on that, we felt pretty confident saying that this particular mutation is not a disease-causing mutation, or else that 3% of people would also have had symptoms. I also have had a little bit of really interesting success lately of just saying who's the person that knows the most about this particular gene, and sending that researcher an email about a particular variant, and they've been able to tell me whether or not that particular thing is showing up more often for them as being disease-causing or really quite benign. So asking experts is a great way to go as well.
So another question that comes up is, do all members of a family who have CMT have the same type of CMT? And the answer is yes. Typically there's just one type of CMT that's running through a family. Even if symptoms are different from person to person, they will all have the same genetic type of CMT. In very rare times do we have families that have two types of CMT that are running in their family. So often it's not necessary for everyone in the family to get genetic testing. If you confirm that someone in the family has a specific type, then everyone who has symptoms of CMT would have that same type. So this is where we wanted to go through some of the ways that CMT is passed along in a family, so you can see who else might be at risk if you have certain types diagnosed in the family. There's three what we call patterns of inheritance, or ways that CMT is passed on in a family. That's we've referred to these terms before, but that's autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, and X-linked. And we'll talk about those three types now. And the method, again, a method of inheritance does not change within a family, because the same type of CMT is going to be passed along from person to person. Autosomal dominant inheritance is has been referred to before. It's when it's only required to have a change in one copy of that gene to have symptoms of the disease. So these examples show two copies of, or two chromosomes, one from mom and one from dad. And one of the bars indicates a mutation or a change that's causing symptoms. So this person is affected by CMT or another autosomal dominant condition, and they have a partner who's unaffected, but it only takes one change to cause symptoms. So for autosomal dominant inheritance, there's a 50% chance of passing it on to each child, because that person who is affected will either pass on the chromosome with the change or the one without. So it's a 1 out of 2 or 50% chance, like flipping a coin. And it does not matter what the partner passes on, because it just matters whether that individual would inherit the gene change or not. This is an example of what we call a pedigree or a family history that we draw up as genetic counselors. And in this example, this is what we would see in a pattern of autosomal dominant inheritance, where you see someone in every generation affected, and the people who are colored in are indicated because they have CMT in this case. And so in this example, you can see dads passing it on to sons, which is an important clue that this is autosomal dominant inheritance versus X-linked. And it's also, we see it in people who are affected, they have a 50% chance of passing it on. For people who don't inherit it, they can't pass it on. So it would end there if someone does not inherit it in autosomal dominant inheritance.
In X-linked inheritance, it makes a difference whether or not it's a female or a male that's affected with the condition. So for a woman who's affected with, so females have 2 X chromosomes and males have an X and a Y chromosome. So in order for a couple to have a son, dad has to pass on his Y chromosome because mom's always going to pass on her X. And in order to have a daughter, dad has to pass on his X chromosome because, again, mom will always pass on her X. So for a mom who's affected with an X-linked type of CMT, she has a 50-50 chance of passing on the X with the mutation or the X without the mutation in every pregnancy. So it ends up being 50-50 chance no matter the sex of a child in this particular type of inheritance. If it's a female, it's 50-50. If it's a male, it's 50-50 if mom is the one that's affected. That's different, though, if dad's the one that's affected because, again, he has to pass on his X chromosome to his daughters, and he has to pass on his Y chromosome to his son. So in X-linked inheritance, dads will pass on the condition to all of their daughters and to none of their sons. In X-linked inheritance, it's a key feature is that men tend to have more severe symptoms than the females in the family. Females are almost always affected in some way, but don't tend to have quite as severe symptoms as the men do. Men don't have this backup copy of that gene like the women do, so they tend to have some amount of, or the women tend to be rescued somewhat by this extra X chromosome. So if you're looking at a family history and you see that females always tend to be less affected and males always tend to be more affected, and you never see a case where dad is passing it on to his son, then you can feel comfortable that this might be a clue that it's an X-linked form of inheritance. So in this picture, if you start at the very top, squares again are males, circles are females, and you have a grandfather that's affected, and he has passed on his CMT to both of his daughters and not to his son. And the daughters then have a 50-50 chance in each pregnancy of passing on the condition, no matter the sex of the child.
So there is a third way that the CMT can be passed on in a family, and that's what we call recessive inheritance. This also does not matter whether it's a male or female, so that component is taken out. But in this type of inheritance pattern, to cause this type of CMT, you need to have changes in both chromosomes on both genes from mom and dad in order to show symptoms. And the people with only one change on one gene are considered carriers because they don't have the disease themselves, but they could have children if their partner also carried a gene change in that same particular gene that causes CMT. So this is an example of 2 parents who do not have CMT themselves, but they both have a change in the same gene. And the way it works is they would have a 1 in 4 or 25% chance of having a child that's affected. You can see the one child that has 2 mutations indicated by those orange bars. They have a 50% chance of having children who are carriers just like them, and they have a 1 in 4 or 25% chance of having a child who's not affected and not a carrier. If someone has a recessive form of CMT, then they have changes in both copies of their gene, so they can only pass on a gene that has a change or mutation. In this situation, the partner is unaffected, and all of the children will be unaffected carriers because they only have one copy of a gene change. The one gene is only affected, the other one's not. So in this situation, we can have families that look like this, where there's no family history, and if two parents are carriers for mutations in the same gene, then they have a possibility, again, a 1 in 4 chance of having a child who's affected. But genetics is tricky and not always as easy as that, and these kind of family histories can fool you, because as Carly was talking about earlier, you can have de novo dominant changes, so a random new change that occurs in a gene that causes a dominant form of CMT. And so in this situation, you would also have no family history, but all of a sudden the person is affected in the family and they're the first. So if I had a family history like this one, I would want to be certain that I'm talking to the person about both recessive and dominant inheritance, because it changes the risk of her having children who are affected by a lot, because the chance of her having a partner who is a carrier for the same genetic cause of CMT in a recessive type is very low, and that's the only way her kids would be affected in a recessive form of CMT. So the chances of her passing it on would be virtually zero if she has a recessive form. However, if she has a de novo dominant form, the chance would still be 50% of passing it on. So that's a big difference when you're working with these families.
So for people who would like to not pass on CMT, and this is obviously a personal decision for each individual family, there are ways that it can be prevented from being passed on, as long as you know what the genetic cause of the CMT is. So you have to have a positive genetic testing result in order to do any type of prenatal or preconception testing. So during pregnancy, there's two things that currently can be done, and one that will probably be available soon, and that's CVS or an amniocentesis. CVS is chorionic villus sampling. And before pregnancy, there's pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. The maternal fetal cell analysis is an up-and-coming thing, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So CVS and amniocentesis have the same idea. They both remove a sample from the pregnancy. So a CVS takes a piece of the placenta, and this can be done between 10 and 12 weeks of pregnancy. And an amniocentesis takes some of the amniotic fluid that surrounds the pregnancy, and this can be done after 15 weeks of pregnancy. In both situations, they're able to take the sample, analyze it to see if the familial mutation is present in the pregnancy. And if this is the case, if the pregnancy does have the mutation, then there would be an option for termination if that was something that was of concern to the family. Some people would use the same information just to know whether or not their kid will be having symptoms, but that brings up some ethical issues that if we have some time, we can go into later on. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is done prior to pregnancy, so it's using in vitro fertilization. So egg and sperm are combined in the laboratory, and they're grown. The embryo is grown until there's 8 cells. 1 to 2 of those cells are then removed from the embryo. They take those cells and they test them to see if they have the mutation. They only then take those embryos that do not have the mutation, which are the green ones here, and they would transfer those into a mother to carry to term and to not have CMT in the future. I'm sorry, there wasn't a slide for the maternal fetal cell, so let me just talk about that for a second. There's new technology that's coming up for doing non-invasive prenatal testing is what it's called, and it looks at fetal cells that have come through the placenta and are found in the maternal bloodstream, or fetal DNA that's in the maternal bloodstream. So right now they're using this to do testing and screening for Down syndrome and trisomy 18, which is an abnormal number in chromosomes. They're pretty big pieces of information. They're doing a bunch of testing to see if they can do single gene disorders, but at this point in time, that's not mainstream. The advantage of doing that would be that there isn't a risk of miscarriage, which there is for doing both CVS and amniocentesis. So you could get some kind of information just based on maternal cell information, so it's the blood draw from mom. But probably even if that came back as positive, they'd recommend following it up with an amnio or a CVS. So it's not 100% at this point. It's not even available at this point, but even for trisomy 18 and Down syndrome, they are currently recommending follow-up with more known diagnostic screening or testing.
So I just wanted to make people aware of our Inherited Neuropathy Consortium, which is part of the Rare Disease Clinical Research Center, and we are combined with sites all around the world to focus on diagnosis, medical management, and treatment for people with different types of CMT. But we're also conducting research at these centers and trying to advance our knowledge about CMT, how different types progress over time, and ultimately the goal is introducing treatments for various forms of CMT. So this is a website that you can go on and register to become involved, and they may ask you to participate in different research projects that are available just online via email or by filling out forms that are important to develop outcome measures to help us understand, again, how CMT progresses over time, which will be important for clinical trials when they're available, so we know what's working or not based on how the natural course of CMT occurs. And so I just wanted to bring that up for people to go online and volunteer. And at this point, I think we can stop and answer questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much for preparing the presentation, Carly and Shawna. That was really good. A number of questions have come in during the presentation, and I think I will start with those rather than try to figure out whether the questions that came in prior to the presentation in the last week were all covered. I'll try to do that latter thing while you're speaking. A couple of questions had to do with insurance, and I know that's not necessarily your area of expertise, but they kind of got at the issue of whether an insurance company will cover the costs of testing. And to summarize, I think one issue is whether there is any logical argument to make to the insurance company as far as the value of the test, given that there's no current treatment, no cure for CMT. Have you seen patients that have successfully argued to their insurance company that they need testing in order to determine for themselves whether there's a risk of interaction with certain drugs that we've identified as being particularly damaging to folks with CMT, or making the argument to the insurance company perhaps that knowing the variant of CMT will help to determine the likelihood of passing on the disease to their offspring or even their children's offspring. Can you address that issue at all?
Yep. So number one is that if there if a person is of childbearing age, using the argument of using the information for family planning actually does tend to work pretty well. And we've had someone from an insurance company tell us that if someone puts that in, then they're pretty likely to get it covered. I've definitely had people that we were trying to work it up, and there was a question about if it was CMT versus something else that was causing it, and making the argument that if we had positive genetic testing, we wouldn't have to continue with the workup, so it can just end. They don't have to do additional, I mean, I can make up all sorts of things. Like, they don't have to do MRIs, they don't need to do extra EMGs. We probably still will do nerve conductions because we like to see how the nerves progress over time. But these additional tests that don't tend to be abnormal in CMT, we would just stop doing. So it can be an advantage over time to the insurance company. I have had some people who had cancer, and there are at least 3 medications that are known to cause CMT to get worse, and they are cancer chemotherapies. So if a person has a diagnosis of cancer and is trying to determine what is the appropriate chemotherapy, knowing whether or not they have CMT, and it's going to be a truly contraindicated drug, that's a very good reason for doing the testing. And like I said before, for someone who said that they were getting IVIG or and it wasn't necessarily working, the question about whether or not to continue it, IVIG is very expensive, so it would be a really good argument that say I no longer need to have IVIG if I have positive genetic testing. That works well too.
Thank you. Got another specific question. It says, not sure if I understood correctly. Is CMT2A always autosomal dominant? And is it always 50% chance of passing on the disease to both female and male offspring? And that kind of, I can broaden that a little bit by adding, I wasn't absolutely clear as to whether variations of CMT, say CMT1A or CMT2, whether the variation of CMT is a determinant of whether it's inherited in a recessive or a dominant way.
So CMT Type 1 and CMT Type 2 are both categories, and there's many different types under those categories. So there's 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, or 2A, 2B, 2C, 2D. They're lumped together because of the area that the nerve is, where the nerve is affected. So Type 1 affects the myelin, Type 2 affects the inside, and the fact that they're both dominant. All of the recessive types are lumped into Type 4. And so it doesn't matter for Type 4 whether it's demyelinating or axonal. The fact that it's recessive lumps it in with Type 4. However, sometimes people are coming in, maybe they have no family history, and they may have an evaluation in nerve conductions or an EMG that says they have, for example, an axonal peripheral neuropathy, and someone says, well, you have CMT Type 2. That could be true phenotypically. Well, the way that they're showing symptoms, it's affecting the inside part of that nerve. And so they have determined they have an axonal neuropathy. Because the person doesn't have a clear family history, you don't know at that point whether it's recessive or dominant. So it still could be a Type 2 that's dominant, that's causing problems with that axon, or it could be an axonal form of a Type 4. And so you still don't know. But sometimes people get confused between the way they're expressing symptoms, what we call the phenotype, and how the nerve is being affected, versus knowing the exact way that something is being passed on in a family. And so, again, it's not till you have a number and a letter that you know the exact genetic cause, and then you know what the pattern of inheritance is. I hope that was clear.
I think that the other piece is, though, we pretend that we know everything, but genetics are so complex, and we keep on being surprised by new things showing up and new ways that proteins are affected. And so we like to put everything into these categories, but on occasion we are surprised. and we have to make new categories for things. So sometimes you'll see some genes that are both in the type 1 and the type 2 categories, and sometimes they show up in type 2 and the type 4 categories. So we don't know everything. We're doing the best we can, but there's certainly things need to be interpreted with caution.
Next question is, if there's a de novo mutation, am I correct that the disease will then become inherited from then on? And second, do we know what percentage of people with CMT have no family history of it?
Part 1, you are correct. So if someone has a brand new dominant mutation that they then, while they're the first people affected in the family, they then will have a 50-50 chance in the future of passing it on in each pregnancy. In terms of the percentage of people with CMT that are de novo, I don't think we know the overall number. Shawna, tell me if I'm wrong. We know that in CMT 1A, which is the most common type of CMT, that about 10% of people have brand new mutation. Shawna, do you know anything differently?
No, I mean, I think it is really based on each subtype. So you're right about CMT 1A and for example, CMT Type 2A, which is the most common axonal form of CMT, the chances of it being a de novo mutation go up potentially to up to 50%. About 50% of the people we see have brand new changes in that type.
Okay. Next question is specific to GDAP1, which I don't know of. The question is, I have CMT1B, MPZ, that was determined by Athena. I also tested positive for GDAP1, but my symptoms are because of the MPZ, and not much is known about GDAP1. Do you know anything more about GDAP1 mutation now?
Yes. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. You can go.
No, you're fine.
So almost all mutations in GDAP1 are recessive. So if someone has a mutation in that gene, we don't think that that should be causing their symptoms. So if you have a known mutation in MPZ, that's most likely the cause of your CMT, and don't worry about the GDAP1 mutation.
Yeah, if you are concerned about chances of passing it on, the mutation in MPZ is dominant, so there would be a 50% chance of passing it on from that. And if you know that you are a carrier for a gene mutation in a GDAP, you can have your partner tested just for that mutation to see if there's another way of passing on a recessive form of CMT. But we would not expect that the mutation in GDAP would cause any changes to your symptom progression.
At least not that we know of.
Yes.
The next questioner would like to know, how can I get a genetic test since no one in my family has it? Who recommends a test, and what other documentation or examination would be useful? Also, do you know anything about getting one in Europe?
So genetic testing, you're typically working with your physician who helped with the diagnosis, and they're ordering the test. And hopefully a genetic counselor is helping to work with you to go through insurance, that type of thing, for testing in the United States, because we work on, it's commercial testing, so you pay money towards the lab, and the lab does the testing for you. And if you can narrow it down to what you're looking for, then it can help to reduce costs. So it is all ordered by a physician. It's ordered by a physician as well in Europe and in other countries, but it's not done on a commercial basis. So the testing costs and things like that are different, and the way that the testing is done is different. Carly, you want to add to that?
Yeah, and so Mary Riley's lab does a bunch of testing for the UK, and I'm not sure, but I think a bunch of different countries. So they are at the National Hospital of Neurology and Neurosurgery in Queen Square, London. So they have the biggest CMT testing lab in the UK.
One of the attendees writes in to say, as a note on insurance, a relative was tested even though they had no symptoms with the EMG. They were tested for only the specific variant I had. The person was glad to be tested to know, but sorry to say they came out as positive. So I guess the point is that perhaps insurance companies are more apt to allow to reimburse for testing if the test is very specific to a CMT variant that's already been shown in the family.
Yes, that's correct. You can significantly cut down on costs if you're testing not only for that particular gene, but also for the mutation that's in the family. It's called familial testing. So the person who originally had testing has their report that basically gives the address to where the change is. And if you can look just at that address, then it's much cheaper. You can get testing for even around $300 just for that particular mutation. So it makes it more reasonable to get testing. What you're describing is getting testing before you're showing symptoms, so it's considered pre-symptomatic testing. And it's really worthwhile to work with a genetic counselor to help weigh the pros and cons anytime you're doing pre-symptomatic testing, because there can be concerns about genetic discrimination and things, because really that person doesn't have a diagnosis, and doing the genetic testing would be making that future diagnosis. There's also other ethical considerations. So for example, we don't typically do pre-symptomatic testing in anyone who's younger than 18 because we feel like it's a personal decision, and there's really no medical need to do it in kids who are not showing symptoms. If the kids are showing symptoms, then you can say that they need medical intervention. But if they're not showing symptoms, it's based on the NSG, so the National Society of Genetic Counselors and other organizations, medical organizations. They don't think that it's necessary to sort of identify those kids as being having a gene change or not.
Here's a related question. Did you want to add something, Carly?
Yeah, I mean, I can go off for a little bit about this genetic discrimination thing. Is the other question related to that?
Yeah, why don't I read it? This will probably factor into your answer. How many, or what's the estimated percentage of your patients that have pursued genetic testing? Has it been helpful clinically? And if it is frequently beneficial, are there a number of patients who have declined testing? And if so, what are the typical reasons for declining?
Okay. All right. Let me go back to the last piece, and then we can jump forward. So what I wanted to add to what Shawna was saying and to the last question, first of all, in addition to doing genetic testing, there are ways to get a genetic diagnosis without doing genetic testing if you have a family history. So, for example, if someone has a family history of CMT1A, their nerve conduction studies are very slow. And if someone doesn't want to find out if they're affected, all they need to do is have a nerve conduction study, and if their conductions are very slow, then they have the diagnosis. They don't need to have genetic testing. They've just done it. So it's basically like non-genetic genetic testing. And for some people, this is really great, and then for other people, this means that maybe someone isn't really having any symptoms, and then they go ahead and they do just a nerve conduction test, and all of a sudden they find out that they're affected. The issues for genetic discrimination are very reasonable. Like, it's something that's really happening. So with healthcare, we're not too worried about it. There's a lot of protections that are in place to keep people from being discriminated against for any genetic reasons. There's HIPAA, which has been in place for 20-plus years, which protects people who currently have a diagnosis. There's people who have symptoms. There's GINA, which protects people who do not have symptoms but have a genetic diagnosis that's been in place since 2008. And then the Affordable Care Act, of course, is now including everybody without thinking about pre-existing conditions. There are no laws, there's no federal laws at all that protect against discrimination for life insurance, long-term care, or disability insurances. CMT is not something that we think of as usually causing someone's lifespan to be shortened, but if a life insurance company sees a positive genetic testing result, that doesn't matter to them necessarily. They just see a positive result, and it's a neurological condition, and a person can be denied life insurance because of that. So before just going ahead and doing genetic testing or even having a nerve conduction, if you have a family history, it's really important to be thinking about all of these things and making sure these things are set up and they're not going to be a problem within your life and the way things are going to move forward if it's a positive test. That was my soapbox.
And I think what comes into play for folks with CMT is the long-term disability, long-term care or disability insurance. So this is, sometimes people find themselves in a situation where they physically can no longer work, but they don't, there's going to be a time period or a period of time where they don't have funding before something like disability kicks in. So there can be short and long-term disability insurances that you obtain to get you between point A and point B financially. And this helps you to maintain an income between the times when you can't work and when you need to go on disability. And if someone tests positive for a debilitating condition that they'll have in the future, it's unlikely that disability insurance will want to fund that person. So these are the reasons why you would set that testing up ahead of time. I think that I would say most of the people that I see are coming in to obtain genetic testing to get a genetic diagnosis. And so although we do see families that decide not to do genetic testing for various reasons, most significantly is cost. That tends to be on the rare side, but that's because probably our sample is skewed because we have people who are flying in, traveling from all over to see us, and so a lot of those individuals are people that are coming in to try to establish those types of diagnoses. And there's probably more people in community-based clinics that don't necessarily like they want to pursue genetic testing, or maybe their physicians are not comfortable on how to order it, make sure it's covered. There's various reasons why people would not get genetic testing. One of the key things is that right now in 2014, there's no cure for any type of CMT. So even if you have that no genetic diagnosis, that doesn't then lead to a pill or something you can take to cure the disease. But that being said, it can help provide information to an individual or their family, and so it doesn't. That's why it's helpful sometimes to work with a genetic counselor. So then, on a one-on-one basis, that person can figure out their reasons maybe to get testing and whether that is something that is of value to them.
One other thing I want to bring up is that some people will talk about getting genetic testing and they will, I'll just pay for this out of pocket. I won't give the results to my insurance company. They are paying for it, so I don't need to tell them about it. And the issue is if someone asks for your records, like if a life insurance or a disability or long-term care insurance asks for your medical records, or if you've ever had testing and you say no, that's fraud. And so they have the right to pursue fraud charges if they want to and can make you pay back anything that they pay into it. And something that probably, if you get genetic testing results, you're probably going to share with some medical professional in your life, your doctors, for example, and that would then become part of your medical record. When any of these companies do check to see if they want to give someone life insurance or long-term care disability insurance, they do request a copy of the medical records. So even if you paid for it out of pocket, they would find it that way.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I have one other question just came in that relates to this, and that is there's always new CMT trials that are starting up, some of them with the promise of new medications that are being tested for treatment of CMT. Do you know whether most of these trials require a genetic test in order to allow somebody to participate in the trial?
Yeah, they all will. At the moment, all of the clinical trials are based on the genetic test results. So the ones that are coming up, for example, CMT1B trials that are coming up are going to be people who have actually very specific mutations in the FTZ gene. So not only just having any type of CMT, but very specific type of mutations that be able to be included. So it all is going to depend on what the particular compound is hopefully going to treat. I mean, we would love to have something that would treat everybody irrespective of what their genetic form of CMT is. At this point in time, that is not what's being evaluated.
And in fact, I would be wary of entering a trial that says that it's for all forms of CMT, because each type of CMT affects the nerve in a very different way, and so we're trying to come up with rational biological reasons for specific treatments. And so not only just myelin or axon, but what that protein is supposed to do, what it's not doing, and coming up with a way to fix that specific problem. So if you have a trial that's being advertised as, this is a treatment for all types of CMT, that would be unusual based on the knowledge that we have right now.
I've got a specific question here about CMT1A. The question goes, my daughter has CMT1A, her dad has CMT symptoms, her paternal grandmother has no symptoms, but her paternal grandmother's brother had symptoms, and so does his son. Does this mean her paternal grandmother does have symptomless CMT? Also, none of my daughters and 3 brothers have symptoms. None of my daughter's 3 brothers have symptoms, but that does not guarantee they do not have CMT, correct? I think I need a chart to actually properly convey that question.
Or a pedigree, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they're especially with CMT1A, we see variation in the expression of disease from person to person, even in the same family. So there can be people that are very mild, that don't show a lot of symptoms, and there are people that are more severe, even in the same family. So a person may not feel like they have CMT or recognize symptoms, but there would always be changes on the nerve conduction studies that indicate a problem with that nerve. And because this occurs, there's actually a project that we're working on specifically for CMT1A that looks at what we call modifier genes that change the expression of symptoms to trigger more severe symptoms in some people and less severe symptoms in other people. So we're identifying these genetic modifiers that would change the expression of symptoms from one person to the next, because that could help us to understand potential treatments down the line. But it is even if someone doesn't show many symptoms or does not report any symptoms, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have a mild underlying CMT. Again, these are slowly progressive conditions. A lot of families live with them their whole lives. They don't, you adapt, and you don't really recognize some of the symptoms that are going on sometimes. So the only way to really test that out would be to do a nerve conduction study or genetic testing for those people. Because this is a dominant form, if someone does not inherit it, they wouldn't be able to pass it on.
It is, of course, possible that grandma's brother has a new CMT, a de novo mutation, and dad has a de novo mutation and it just happened to both happen in the same family, it's not the likeliest situation, but these things happen. So it's not outside the realm of genetic possibilities.
Although the more likely with this type of CMT, more likely it's someone that had very mild symptoms they didn't recognize as being CMT.
Well, we've got a couple of questions that came in that have to do basically with where information about new clinical studies can be found. And I think the best answer to that is to visit the CMTAUSA.org website or perhaps some other sources that Carly or Shawna can provide here. There's always new studies, and there's no central coordination of the studies, of course, since they all happen in different universities and different research organizations. But I think the CMTA USA website tries to keep track of that. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, apart from this, our website, the INCRDCRC, which has all of our active studies, there's also a website called clinicaltrials.gov that all of the U.S.-based clinical trials are announced on. So you can go in there and type in CMT or Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, and they would bring up all of the active studies that are funded in the U.S. If you have anything to add.
It's a required thing to post to it. So anyone that's doing any kind of clinical trials in the U.S. must have that listed on clinicaltrials.gov in order to actually be a clinical trial. So it's a really good place to go. It does have not just the ones that are active, but it has sometimes ones that are not yet recruiting. It says if it's currently recruiting. It says if it's active, it's stopped recruiting, and it says if it has stopped. It's not always great at saying this has finished and here are the results. But sometimes if you see that the study has completed, you can go someplace else to see if you can find what the results are.
And they should have contact information for the centers on that website, as well as the locations of where people are conducting the research.
I think we've answered nearly all of the questions that came in during the presentation. So I'd like to thank both of you again for taking the time and putting in the effort to prepare this great, informative webinar. And if you have anything to add, now's a good time to do it. Otherwise, I'll say goodbye to everyone.
No, we appreciate everyone's time. We know this is an important and very complex topic. So I appreciate people calling in, and we are on the CMTA Advisory Board. So we try to reach out to the community as much as possible to share our knowledge. And if there's other ways to do that, if people have insights about how we can help the community, we're happy to hear those too.
Well, thank you very much, Carly and Shawna. It's been a pleasure. And those of you on the webinar, look for the next webinar happening in just about a month, and we will see you there. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Correct.
Bye-bye.